What's up? Doc Mike. Public Health on Call. By Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's topic for September 30, 2020. COVID-19 and the looming eviction crisis. Thank you, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
Welcome to Season 2 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today, Stephanie Desmond speaks with Emily Benfer, a Wake Forest University law professor and co-creator of a COVID-19 housing policies scorecard, which tracks state-level measures to prevent evictions. They discuss the severe eviction crisis that is looming across the country as COVID-related unemployment threatens to force tens of millions from their homes in the coming months. Let's listen.
Emily Benfer, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So early on in this pandemic, we saw eviction moratoriums and we saw Congress provide $600 a week in extra unemployment. These programs could be ending soon. Then what?
Then I think the United States is going to see the biggest housing crisis in our history. I mean, we have never seen this level of housing instability or threat of eviction in such a truncated amount of time in our entire country's history. Just to put this in perspective, about 10 million people over a period of years were displaced from their homes following the foreclosure crisis in 2008. And early estimates today have estimated that between 20 to 28 million renters are at risk of eviction, and as many as 16.9 to 17 million households. So that's about 40 million people who are struggling with rent burden and facing eviction today.
That's extraordinary. Is this all because of COVID?
The vast majority, yes. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in extreme job and wage loss that's been well documented. As of June 2020, 44.2 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance, and the unemployment rates have fluctuated at extreme levels between 11 and 14.4%. And so as a result, these renters have suffered extreme income loss, and many of it happening in low-income households. So these families have been unable to scrape the rent together and are stretching in ways that are evidence of this hardship. So increase in applications for rental assistance, increase in applications for food assistance, upwards of 2,000% increase in some states. They're paying the rent on credit cards. They're taking loans out on any property that they own just to make the rent and keep a roof over their family's head during a pandemic in which people are being told to shelter in place and to stay home.
Well, what happens if these folks are evicted?
Eviction almost always leads to a downward move, to a higher crime community, to substandard housing that poses a threat to health and safety, to poorer quality school systems, and it's incredibly hard to climb back up from. Once an eviction is filed, it puts a scarlet E on a tenant's record, which is often used to preclude them from housing opportunities in the future. Eviction records are used for screening processes by landlords who are trying to identify tenants for new units and for new rent. In addition, it causes significant harm to health and well-being. It's well documented that eviction and housing instability are pathways to poor health. They have high healthcare expenditures and steep societal costs. In particular, eviction results in diminished mental and physical health, depression, unemployment, suicidal ideation, suicide, homelessness, and all of these negative outcomes. It also causes respiratory disease, which, as we know, is a risk factor for COVID-19 complications and mortality. So this mere threat of eviction can increase all of these harms and have a long-term impact on health and well-being that will take a very long amount of time to recover from.
Mm-hmm. And also, as you mentioned earlier, we're basically being told to shelter in place. And so where will folks be able to be socially distant from one another?
So they probably won't. So eviction, it often results in doubling up, in couch surfing and staying with families and friends. Especially when you have children, you will do anything you can to stay out of the shelter system. Typically, when a family enters the shelter system, it can take upwards of a year to get out of it and into stable housing. And so in these overcrowded situations, people are going to have a very challenging time social distancing, and it will increase their exposure risk just by a mere fact of increased contact with other people.
Mm-hmm. Who is the most vulnerable here?
So the single greatest predictor of an eviction is the presence of a child. So families are extremely vulnerable right now to eviction. And they're also some of the people who have been hardest hit by the pandemic and in industries that have also been hard hit. At the same time, eviction has always had a disproportionate impact on people of color. COVID-19 is no exception to that. Black and Latinx populations have experienced COVID-19 job loss, infection, and death at higher rates than any other demographic. And they're also consistently reporting low confidence in their ability to pay the rent during the pandemic. A Pew Research study found that 70% of Black and Hispanic adults said that they do not have emergency funds right now to cover 3 months of expenses. Only about half of white adults said the same. So without public financial support to really protect these families from eviction, these racial and socioeconomic disparities can be expected to increase and widen due to the negative long-term effects of eviction.
Mm-hmm. What about the landlords here? I mean, they are running businesses and they need rent to keep going as well.
Exactly. The non-payment of rent caused by COVID-19 is increasing rental property owner hardship, and it's also increasing the risk of foreclosure and bankruptcy. And this is especially true for small property owners who often lack the financial cushion that's necessary to sustain shortfall in rent. Individual investors own the majority of rental units in the market, and these mom and pop landlords, they primarily own single family rentals, small apartment properties, amounts to about 74% of rental properties. But more than half of them don't have access to credit to cover emergency costs. So when the rent isn't paid, these property owners aren't able to pay their mortgages, they aren't able to pay property taxes. This could trigger the foreclosure and bankruptcy cycle. It will affect the local lenders and credit unions. And then even more, this house of cards starts to fall, and the rent hardship ultimately negatively affects communities and results in extreme societal cost for those communities. Because when the rent isn't paid and the property tax isn't paid, these are crucial to sustaining community resources, especially schools and state and local governments. On average, local governments supply about 45% of school budgets, and 80% of that comes from property tax.
You're presenting a really scary scenario here.
This is a full-blown crisis that will have long-term impacts for renters, for families, for property owners, the housing market, and our communities. And we will be paying for the outcome of this for generations to come. The good news is that it's entirely preventable and intervene.
How?
So I think there's a twofold approach. First and foremost, we have to stop the bleeding. So there must be public funding made available to pay the rent, that until the economy recovers and viable jobs are available that will enable renters to pay the rent and to pay the back rent that's accrued over this time, we have to provide that public support to sustain the housing market and keep people housed during this time of extraordinary uncertainty and hardship, and also prevent eviction during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, for those people who are already in the eviction system, knowing that it has severe long-term effects, negative effects for those families and individuals, ensuring that the system is equitable, that people have a right to legal counsel, and that we invest in diversion programs to ensure people stay housed during this time. And then it's time to unpack the root causes of the affordable housing crisis that predates the pandemic, and especially housing precarity among communities of color.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it's not enough to just stop evictions, right? I mean, we need people to be paying the rent as well.
That's right. In order to protect the housing market itself, we need to ensure that people are able to pay the rent, and that the local communities, the local governments have already exhausted all of the rental assistance funds that they can. And these programs that have popped up across the country have been depleted in a matter of 90 minutes in Houston, for example, to one business day in Louisiana. And so the federal government truly does need to intervene and lift up all of these states and communities in order to preserve the housing market and protect the people who are in it.
I don't think that people really understand how serious this is, because I know that I didn't understand the severity of it until we started having this conversation.
Yeah, I think housing is often an overlooked issue, that many people aren't aware that before COVID-19, before the pandemic, the majority of renter households below the poverty line spent half of their income toward rent. Over 1 in 4 spent 70% of their income toward housing costs. 1 in 4 people who are eligible for federal financial assistance receive it. So we had, going into the pandemic, over 20.8 million families who experienced rent hardship. We had a very severe housing instability crisis. And when we lost all of these jobs, it increased dramatically in a very short amount of time. So the safety net that was in place before the pandemic was already threadbare. And then when you add 40 million people at risk of eviction, it's going to snap out from under us.
I guess so the real answer is getting rent money into the hands of renters for now.
And ensuring that it's going to the rent so that we can sustain this housing market, right? And at the same time, adding that unemployment insurance, because renters who have lost their jobs, they have countless other bills and debt that's building that they need to be able to respond to. That housing is one of the necessities that enable people to thrive and to allow for a livelihood and accessing opportunity. And so all of these need to be built up together. But first and foremost, if people can't stay housed, we're pulling the very foundation out from under them.
Absolutely. And once this pandemic is over, how do you suggest we move ahead and to avoid this in the future?
Well, so if you look at the affordable housing crisis that predated the pandemic, there were 3 main causes. And the first was the rising cost of housing combined with the stagnant wage across the country. That as housing rates and renter costs continued to grow, we never actually built up the livable wage. And so 1/3 of American workers earn less than $12 an hour, and that's not enough to keep up with those rent increases. And then at the same time, we never supplied the federal funding to ensure affordable housing, with only 1 in 4 eligible households receiving federal financial assistance. So that created this perfect storm of an increasingly growing housing affordability crisis. And then when we take out what there was for income, it plummeted. So I think those are the 3 things that we have to start tackling. But also, how do we invest in our communities? How do we really address and get to the bottom of the reasons for the disproportionate impact on eviction on communities of color, especially Black households who are suffering from eviction at the highest rates? Even before the pandemic, in a study of multiple cities of people facing eviction, 80% were Black. And so this is a symptom of a bigger problem that we have to address going forward. I think the pandemic both magnified and underscored this crisis and all of the root causes that led to it. And it's upon us as a society to ask the question, are we going to finally hold as central to what it means to be American to have a home? Or are we going to continue to allow this widespread eviction solely because people couldn't shoulder the enormous weight of this economic crisis and the pandemic?
Emily Benford, thank you so much for your interesting insights today.
Thank you.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Lamari Morales. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.